Dr. Wagner here for our last live discussion, number 6. Hopefully we are not having problems accessing the discussion link. I know there were some issues. Thanks, Deshawn. I appreciate that. And so I think what I can do, because only one of them was uploaded, because of course there was some discrepancy on my side in terms of, was it due on the 19th, or are we talking about it on the 19th? And of course, I'm still maintaining flexible due dates for everybody. So it's really, that makes a conversation like this a little bit more difficult in general. But the grad students, essentially, when you take a class at the graduate level, there's an extra piece that's supposed to be at whatever that level is, in this case, mostly master's students. And I apologize if I have any doc students in here. So they were asked to do a separate assignment where they looked to evaluate the health need in a population. And so because of that, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen a little bit. Hi, Madeline. Oh, sorry. She's like, yeah, not here to talk to you. Sorry. That's fine. And so that we can see what a couple of these were and just see what we think about it, of course. Where is my share button? Here we go. One of these days I'll figure this out. All right, so I'm going to share my entire screen because I have everything turned off. So this was Alyssa's. This was the one that was available. And Jane and I were just commenting on how much we like I like the colors as well as the text. I'm always appreciative. And sometimes students will say, do we have to use PowerPoint? Because I prefer this other mechanism. And so Alyssa looked specifically at Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders and their experiences with diabetes. So with some basic data about who these folks specifically are, some history of, I'm going to say, colonization, right, or ways in which the United States and our founding folks continued to sort of take control of spaces and therefore include certain people within our population that maybe weren't affected in that way. Living in the islands, as Alyssa points out, there are different resources. Fishing is huge. And I appreciate this reference down here because these folks are in little bags, but I think it's also a little bit indicative of the problem that we're having with seafood as we continue to pollute the ocean, which may or may not be what Alyssa meant. But notice once they sort of got taken over, for lack of a more politically sensitive way to say it, diet was affected by tourism and increases in sugar and salt consumption. And we'll see that in a lot of populations where they might, as an ethnicity, have certain health issues and health strengths, but then when they come and sort of become acculturated into American society, there are some problems. And so that unhealthy diet, like in most populations, leads to increase in health concerns. And so she chose specifically to look at CVD, cancer, and diabetes, and talk specifically about those rates. And then keeping in mind, or keeping in line, I should say, with our agency profiles, the grad students were asked to also identify agencies and organizations that might already be doing this work. And so notice that there were 2, at least, different organizations specifically focusing on Asian and Pacific Islander health. And so at least there's that strength. And then we get into the suggestions for culturally appropriate practice. And this is, I think it's so important for us as humans, but particularly as health coaches, to be thinking about our cultural limitations that we might have when trying to help somebody in a different space. And so the suggestions for culturally appropriate practice here, I think, are pretty strong. So first is understanding the history of the people and the impact of that colonization. So good. I'm glad Alyssa use the word as well. So it's not just me imparting that. So again, when the white folks came in and attempted to kind of control everything, there's going to be obvious pushback to that because it's like, hey, we're fine. And then also some of that, like, we call it, it would be assimilation, which is has some negative context that I think is appropriate. But again, as those cultures combine, there are certain elements of other culture that we maintain and certain elements of that culture that we squash out. And obviously, there's also cultural appropriation. It's more complicated than I'm making it. But understanding the history becomes very important when we're understanding any culture. Second, keeping in mind the importance of family and tradition and the familial support, different ways of healing. And so we talk about Eastern medicine versus Western medicine, but there are far more versions of that. And so you'll notice here she identifies things like socioeconomics, stereotypes, stress, so on and so forth. All pretty much, again, leading back to this idea that these people were living there and then were disrupted by the colonizers who came to take over. And so specific healing practices are identified here where folks could do some more research on those if you're interested. And even here where she jumps this in the little computer, it's so savvy. So thinking about ideas and values with regard to the people that we're dealing with, also responding to guidance through tradition and culture. So though we've made mistakes in the past, it doesn't mean we should keep repeating those mistakes as we move forward. And so that would be one example. Let me see. Jane, if you don't mind, this is yours. You can participate or not to the extent. So female genital circumcision or female genital mutilation. And here the C could also be cutting, again, depending on to whom we're talking and in what context. That language is different. Folks who identify with this practice often just refer to it as circumcision, and folks who are more opposed to it then will bring in that female genital mutilation. And this one seems to be focusing on the continent of Africa, and we'll see as we dial down if we get into some of those cultural things. When I was in Zimbabwe, we weren't quite there long enough. There were a couple of spaces where I had opportunities to talk about things I've really wanted to talk to people about in country. And Zimbabwe still has a pretty significant level of female circumcision. So, and the cutting often, and perhaps I shouldn't overspeak. Maybe I should just let Jane do it in their presentation. Cutting is one of those, it's often perceived as a contemporary, what's the word I'm looking for? Oh gosh, compromises, I guess. So if we look at female circumcision, sometimes we were referring to this as a way of, and let me just move forward to make sure, here we go, the different types. So notice that all 4 types here are identified. So clitoridectomy, where the clitoris is either partially or totally removed. Excision, where the clitoris, in addition to the labia minora and sometimes the labia majora, are excised or removed. Type 3 is infibulation, where they not only remove, and not always, as she says here, but generally it's a removal of the clitoris and the labia, and then also a sewing together with only a slight opening allowed. And then type 4 is, as I said, kind of this new version where sometimes there are cultural compromises where there is just a ceremonial prick or piercing or incising or, as is further identified, there's scraping or cauterization. And so there's different levels of participation in this, and also different levels of buy-in. So if you notice, the health impacts here are definitely immediate. Definitely there is some disruption to the genitourinary tract, especially in the infibulation type, where there's just a tiny opening through which the person still has to urinate and menstruate. There are obstetrics issues. So when the person goes to become pregnant and or deliver a baby, there's a pathway problem that often requires some more surgical intervention or some additional anatomical destruction that can happen. I think it should hopefully go without saying that if we remove a person's clitoris, their opportunity to experience sexual pleasure is drastically reduced, if not eliminated. And then the psychosocial, and here again, different cultures that practice this. Let me see who else I can admit here. There are varying levels of consent here, and sometimes it's a coercive consent. Sometimes it's free consent, and sometimes there's zero consent. And so each cultural experience of this is slightly different. And so, sorry, I'm moving too fast. And so obviously, given those different levels, the outcomes might be very different. I know in my human sexuality class, I used to show an Egyptian video where the young girl does technically consent and she does walk in there of her own fruition and lie down and allow it. But then during it, she's screaming like, I did not want this to happen to me. And you did this to me. And it's auditorily, the reason I don't show it anymore is actually because of the auditory presence of that film. So there are lots of issues with this, and I will leave those for you to peruse. I'll upload the rest of these so that we have them all. And she very clearly, the student goes through and identifies what all of these issues can be, as well as the contributing factors. And I appreciate your use of air quotes here, that it saves someone. And so depending again on the specific culture, sometimes it is that sort of adulthood ceremony. And then a lot of times it is there also too. In that film, the father was saying, if we don't remove her clitoris, it can get very warm and it can cause her difficulty. And so, making an argument for removing it to benefit. And so here you can see at least 200 million female identified folks across 31 countries, particularly in Africa with 80% of the cases. And again, when we were traveling to Zimbabwe and I was preparing my educational materials, HIV/AIDS was still the leading cause of death, and about 85% of the folks with vulva vaginas were circumcised. So notice also Middle East, elements of Asia, and a little bit of Latin America. And we do find when you talk with gynecologists in the United States, you'll find that most of them have at least part of their practice where they deal with not only the consequences of genital circumcision, but also some folks who bring their cultural feelings with them and perhaps want like their hymens replaced, or they're seeking circumcision from a physician. And so because you're here, Jane, is this hurting you that I'm doing this for you? Or
no.
Okay.
I just wanted to say something, like,
please.
Yeah. So I'm from Kenya, and there's some parts, this is not practiced in my community. And I've not, like, just going through this, I've never done through, like, I just know this FGM, but I've never known, like, the stages to it. And I'm just like, what?
Yeah.
So I'm just as shocked as some of you. You're like, what is this?
Yeah. The video I watched in college was actually very tribal. So it was like the mother and the daughter walked out into on a trek for several days, and the practitioner used an instrument that was not sterile or appropriate. And that little girl, they sat her on her mother's lap, and her mother used her arms to hold her arms and her legs to hold her legs. There was no anesthesia, no mechanisms taken to prevent disease transmission. And at the end of it, they tied her clitoris to her wrist so she could sort of like continue to think about the procedure, which is, it's just like misogyny on an extra level, not to be inappropriate, but pretty problematic. Although, in the interest of full disclosure, I put female circumcision right next to male circumcision in my human sexuality class, because though physically the procedures are totally different, a lot of the arguments for why they're done are exactly the same. And removing the foreskin of the penis does not have any of the consequences as removing the clitoris or the labia. And so I'm not at all equating them to, but the rationale behind them are very similar. So in any case, also highlighted in this presentation is how this is a growing issue and not necessarily a reduction process. So often we think as places become a little bit more progressive, or we learn, you know, in recent years, for example, we've had cultures where women have been given the right to drive and things of that nature, where their culture experience as women is modernizing. That doesn't necessarily happen. And then the United Nations has passed a resolution only about a decade ago, but still to try to help bring about cultural change. Most of the religious arguments, when you actually look in the religious documents, it's interpreted and not actually super clear. And most of the health reasons that are argued for why circumcision of any kind should happen are actually not based on really strong science. And so that's where some of the cutting, and again, I'll continue to call it a compromise, where then there could still be that cultural practice and that rite of passage. You know, I think about the Jewish bris, where it's a party where we all drink wine, or at least the ones I've been at, I'm drinking wine and eating cheese, and they perform a circumcision on the newborn baby's penis publicly. And so again, if you put those arguments or the rationales behind why those things are happening, they're happening for very similar reasons, that it's some kind of agreement, either culturally or religiously, that we participate in this sacrifice for whatever the reasons are. But I think I would argue that the circumcision of the vulva vagina is the most graphic and anatomically destructive. And so those gynecologists also will share their surgical restoration stories as well, because as we've gotten better with microsurgeries, obviously if the clitoris is just severed, we can't reattach, but some of those nerve endings, there is some reparation, some surgical reparation that is able to give them some relief, I guess I should say. And here are the organizations. So you've got the Desert Flower Foundation, and then Equality Now, and then the Wallace Global Fund. And this one has a goal of bringing an end by 2030. So agencies dedicated specifically to this. Also supporting the training of the healthcare professionals. Even in penile circumcision in the United States, it's only been recently, like in the last 10 to 20 years, that we started using anesthesia and doing consent, active rather than passive. Also providing that support. You know, some of these folks need surgical reconstruction to have intercourse and other sexual behaviors that aren't painful and severely damaging, especially that infibulation. That one is just very destructive. Trying to help educate communities about equity and equality, and again, ways in which we can sustain cultural practices. But noticing this last point, that often this is related to economic opportunities related to marriage. And so especially in that complete infibulation one, there's an entire ceremony that sometimes includes other people on the wedding night, where that perforation of that space is again ceremoniously opened, which makes for a very different kind of wedding night than most people anticipate. Here you have strengthening the health systems and providing support, and then in general educating professionals. So the student purports that this should be treated first and foremost as a gender inequality issue, which I think most folks would absolutely agree with. Again, this idea of women as commodities in cultures where that marital union is still really strongly connected to familial wealth and reputation, I guess I should say. And so thinking about that in different ways can definitely be something that helps this. Notice legislation and policy, so looking at that whole socioeconomic model, social ecological model, pardon me, where we educate young people about, you know, the truth around this, as well as some of the increases in laws around marriage in general, as well as child marriage and so on and so forth. So I appreciate that one so much. It's a very difficult topic, but it's, I think, one that folks are needing to know about, especially as we participate with folks in our spaces culturally. And now I stopped sharing and lost my last. Okay, here we go. And this one is and I still have an athlete one too, but I know I'm running out of time. This one was looking specifically at COPD in folks ages 65 years and older, which is, again, even further amplified by our COVID situation. So chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is a respiratory disease, and notice here caused by a combination of things with very specific symptoms, not a cure, but some treatment that can help mitigate some of the symptoms. Notice air pollution, which is kind of strong in the US, secondhand smoke, chemicals, dust, so on and so forth. And so it can definitely cause some heart issues that can lead to a variety of physical symptoms that then can affect general health and activity. Notice that there's some identification specifically of this population that definitely is going to affect how we might treat them or work with them on COPD. And so some strong data here on sex and racial and ethnic differences of this population specifically that makes it more specific. And so notice here we have professional recommendations. So this one comes from a physician that says, you know, prioritizing the health problems, person was oxygen dependent. And so that, again, you know, if you always have to have your oxygen with you, then that can cause some issues. And notice they're also talking about some mental health connections, also trying to help prevent other diseases like the flu and pneumonia, and I think we would probably also add COVID to this right now, stopping ingesting things into our lungs. And so smoking cessation or staying away from secondhand smoke can also be helpful. And then specifically, I mean, this one has its own foundation in addition to the American Lung Association. And then notice here, Better Breathers Club or the Lung Helpline or some groups for people who experience these issues. And so helper recommendations here as well. So again, just a different version of cultural understanding such that people can have better access to okay, that's going to make me angry. The things that they need when we're talking with them specifically. So unfortunately, I'm not gonna, that last one, let me stop sharing my screen because now it's just a mess. That athlete and stress one as well was in here. Oh, Caitlin, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you turned your camera on. Did you want to say something or did I do okay? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, everything's great. Just here participating.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Glad to see your face. I wasn't trying to make you say anything. But all right. So for those of us that aren't in the room currently, I've hit my limit. And of course, I started with trying to get stuff open that didn't work appropriately. So I will add the other presentations. I like this part, even though it didn't work out super great this time because of the schedule or whatever. And I don't want to make the grad students not have flexible deadlines just so we can talk about their projects. But I often am disappointed as an instructor when you all do like all this great work and I'm the only one that gets to see it. So I will go ahead right now, once I'm done with our discussion, and add those additional presentations. And then those of you that are not in the room, I'll also add the discussion questions for your points once I'm done. So I'm going to go ahead because that is our time, even though that felt fast and furious and was just me talking. I'm going to stop our recording.